with a focus on tools, guidances, and documentations for practitioners in DRR. Short remark with regards to this webinar, which will last about 90 minutes. So we will have a very short introduction to the platform who elaborated these tools, and then the main part will focus on the presentation of 6 tools. And at the end, there is also space for general feedback and also for a short outlook of platform events for the upcoming year. Some general remarks for the beginning. Please unmute your microphone. I think that's done with everyone. For the questions, there is on one hand the chat function in the text file, in the text box you can see on the left side, and also there will be a short Q&A session where you can unmute your microphone and orally ask the questions directly. This webinar presentation will later be online on our website of the DRR platform. And I would just like to mention that we are also recording this webinar so that everyone is aware about. So a very short introduction to the Swiss NGO DRR platform. As you could read from the invitation, the products that we will present in a moment, they are all developed by the Swiss NGO DRR platform, which works along 3 main pillars. That is, on one hand, capacity building, where we develop face-to-face workshop or further learning material as e-learning courses. Then the second pillar refers to support related to concepts, technical advice. That's in this frame where we develop the tools which we are going to present in a moment. And the third pillar refers to advocacy. So we use our convening power to advocate for DRR and climate change adaptation in Switzerland as well as internationally. And the platform is co-founded by the NGO and SDC, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. So further information with regard to the platform, you can all find it online on our website. So far, you only heard my voice, but actually we are 5 people hosting this webinar presenting the different tools. There is Jana Junghart from Caritas, who will present after my presentation the advocacy packing list and the compilation of best practices for DRR. Thereafter, Manuel from CBM will present the IDRR hands-on tool. We'll then have a presentation from Anton Jör from the Swiss Red Cross on the indicator toolbox. Thereafter follows Georg Heim, also from Swiss Red Cross, who will present the cost-benefit analysis tool. And myself, I'm Evelyn Studer, working at Helvetas, and I will start in a moment now with the first tool on the guidance for DRR mainstreaming. These are the mentioned 6 different tools that we are going to present in a moment. So these are all the 6 main products that have been elaborated since 2017 by the platform. They're all shaped for practitioners involved in the context of development or humanitarian projects or programs. Some of them, as the first tools, they're rather for a general public, which don't require a specific background. And then we'll have at the end also some products that we present which require a certain background knowledge in DRR. I hope all of you can find something interesting for your work. All the 6 products that we are going to present, they, as mentioned, the target audience are practitioners typically working in NGOs, but also might be donors who are involved in any stage of a project, being the design, the planning, or the, the implementation, as well as the evaluation phase. So it's meant for all of them. But since there are already so many publications and tools that have been elaborated by other organizations, our work was mainly to focus on the existing tool, to provide guidance in order to compare these different tools and to fill the relevant gaps. All products which we'll present, they were elaborated by working groups who analyzed the existing information and elaborated thereafter a kind of a pilot guidance. This was then tested and adjusted by the feedback of NGO practitioners, and then we had also thematic expert. And then we also had various events for the instruction and the dissemination of these tools, as for instance this webinar. So let me start then with the first tool presentation, which is the DRR and climate change adaptation mainstreaming guidance. So as its title says, it aims to integrate the concepts and principles of DRR and climate change adaptation into development or humanitarian projects. We'll have to keep in mind that for mainstreaming and the consideration of recording aspects and measures into projects, there is much more required than just the guidance or just the tools, such as organizational will, management backup, incentives, financial resources, a learning culture, and so on. So with this guide, we only focus on the practical aspects of the tool. We identified, therefore, two entry points, which is mainstreaming along sectors and contexts, as well as mainstreaming along different stages of the project cycle management. The guide has multiple objectives, which is defined a bit through its substructure. So the first part, the first chapter, refers to the principles for DRR and climate change adaptation mainstreaming. Then we want to provide support for the identification of the appropriate tools, where we present the various of these tools, and then we also really explicitly describe the advantages and the challenges of the different tools in a separate chapters. And we also have then, as a last chapters, there is also a description of further resources and tools that could be relevant, where further information can be found. So as mentioned, the first entry point is to mainstream DRR and climate change adaptation along the different stages of the PCM. So for each stage, we have identified key elements for mainstreaming with some reference information and also some reference tools, such as, for instance, a quick screening checklist for the initial design stage, or the classical risk analysis as an in-depth planning stage, or as well as the cost-benefit analysis for the evaluation stage. Then there is a section with regards to the main tools on mainstreaming DRR in the project cycle management. We identified the main tools as they are used and co-developed by the members of the DRR platforms, kind of typical NGO practitioners. And each of the tools, they are described in the annexes. They are summarized on a two-pager with a description on their advantages and drawbacks, as well as further reference information. As I mentioned at the beginning, the second entry point for DRR and climate change adaptation mainstreaming is the entry point by sectors and by contexts. So we had a look about to include it there, as you can see by the illustration. We distinguished between the main sectors, which are agriculture, environment, natural resources, water, the health sector, education, infrastructure, and then also the two specific contexts, which is the urban context as well as the emergency recovery context. So for each of the sector or context, we identified then the main guiding tools for the integration of DRR and climate change principles. There are other organizations which have much more resources to do an in-depth inventory of tools. So there is a selection of such kind of tool compendia. They are also presented in our guidance. Nevertheless, in practice, we rather tend to apply a few proved tools instead of getting lost in the endless variety of tools, which often required much more in-depth knowledge and time to apply them. Nevertheless, you will find these additional tools, you will find them also in the guidance as a reference. So I'm coming to the last part of the guidance, which is actually the Excel that you can find in these annexes. But I would say this is probably the most interesting and most relevant part of the tools. So you find in the Excel sheet, you find two subsheets, which is one is an instruction note of how to use it. There is an illustration, as I've just shown you early, with the structure of the entry points through the project cycle management stages and the different sectors and contexts. And then you will find under the sheet of sectors and context, as well as on another sheet of PCM tools compendia, there you would find a list of different tools which you can then filter and analyze through the filters you find on the columns on the right side. So you can make a research per language, per sector, per specific user profiles. Is it someone who is rather involved in the planning stage or in the implementation stage, and so on. And then you will find the web links, or you can even, we also made a kind of a rating from the point of view of practitioners, how useful are these tools in order to quickly find the most relevant tools. Okay, this is very shortly the mainstreaming guidance. Let me know if there is some questions, some specific questions to some of the contexts I presented here with. You might either use the text box on the left side, or you just can unmute also your microphone. Any question? Okay. If there's no specific question at this stage, I would then suggest to continue with the next presentation that will be done by Jana, who will present us in a moment the DRR Compendium of Good Practices.
Good morning, everyone. Also from my side, I'm Jana from Caritas Switzerland, working on the DRR and climate change adaptation, as most of you are also involved with. And yes, I'm going to present to you two products that the platform published in the past 2 years. The first one is a compendium on, yes, we called it a compendium of good practices in DRR, which links sustainable land management and disaster risk reduction. The idea behind this quite massive publication, we have it printed, it's quite heavy, but of course it is also available online through our website. The idea behind this tool, or behind this publication, was, the idea behind it was to document links between sustainable land management and disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. with a second very important objective to contribute to the growing knowledge base on nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and for climate change adaptation. To reach these objectives and also to foster regional exchange of knowledge among our partners and among the different members of the platform, we partnered with the VOCAD Secretariat of the University of Bern. VOCAD stands for World Overview of Conservation Approaches and Technologies, and we used their methodology to document cases, to document very concrete technologies, and to also document overarching approaches for sustainable land management that at the same time have very strong benefits for disaster risk reductions. This was based on the idea that the way that we manage land is not only impacting livelihoods of people, but can also increase or reduce disaster risks. And in the DRR community, we often face the question, can just managing the land prevent disasters? Isn't it more effective or more tested to build grey infrastructure? So this compendium is also a clear advocate for daring and for investing in green infrastructure, for investing in nature-based solutions, and in reaping the benefits reaping the multiple benefits that these nature-based solutions can offer. Just a glimpse into the publication. In total, we documented 44 technologies and approaches from 8 member organizations of the platform and their partners, covering 11 countries across the globe. So you see here on the slide, you see the 11 countries where we documented practices, and you also see the name of the practice that you can then look up in the publication. In the lower right corner, you also see different icons which indicate which hazards were addressed. And if you look at the countries, here you should now see my the little arrow. For example, for Tajikistan, where we documented pasture user unions and how they contribute to disaster risk reduction. You see that they have a potential to address hazards such as flood, drought, rainstorm, and landslide. We also integrated a color code which reflects the core theoretical backbone of this publication, which is the so-called risk staircase. My colleague Anton Dürr from the Swiss Red Cross will also say a few more words on the risk staircase in a later part of this webinar. But just from my end, our logic behind this risk staircase is to implement a successful and holistic disaster risk management. And if we think about disaster risk as the full staircase, going down this risk staircase along the logic of preventing the creation of new risk, that is to integrate a disaster and climate change adaptation lens into all our new project planning, into all investments, as a second step to reduce existing risk through prevention and mitigation, risk mitigation, and as a third, last but not least step, to deal with risk through preparedness for response, through risk transfer and sharing, and ultimately through bearing the remaining risk, that disaster risk that can never be fully eliminated. And following this logic, we documented case studies, we analyzed them, and I will just give you a brief glimpse of one case study. The rest and at the remaining 43 cases you can look up in the publication that is available on our website. So for example, from Tajikistan we documented pasture user unions and communal pasture management, which were implemented in the frame of an integrated watershed management program. And in a context of very continental, harsh climate conditions and high levels of precipitation in spring, which coincide with snow melt, steep slopes in the upper parts of the watershed, yes, and high or strong land use in the lower parts of the watershed. We have a situation where access to water, land degradation, overgrazing, low livestock productivity, as well as land tenure are issues which can be partly addressed through communal pasture management and the setup of pasture user unions. We documented 3 technologies: rotational grazing in grazing plots to allow faster recovery of degraded pastures, communal pasture management as an overarching approach to structure and manage the rotational grazing, the pastures that are being set aside, and to better manage the way that livestock is moving across the pastures. And very concrete, the setup of water points for livestock to ensure that livestock is not led up the slopes and down the slopes several times during the day, which also reduces the impact of livestock on erosion. So in the publication we document how the technologies and the approaches reduce or contribute to reduction in of disasters, of landslides, of soil degradation, etc., but also how they benefit water availability and quality, how they positively impact on livelihoods and employment, and how they protect soils and contribute to erosion control. And yeah, of course, we have a number of findings from this overview from different approaches linking sustainable land management and DRR. But one that I would like to highlight for this round is the comprehensive benefits of the measures that we implemented or that we documented. So while all measures have as their objective to reduce risk and to manage disaster risk, 2/3 of them do also contribute to secure livelihoods and to environmental protection, so cover quite a comprehensive package with multiple benefits. And 1/3 of the documented technologies and approaches do contribute to improved risk management and secured livelihoods or protection of environment. And our publication should give you, should serve as a compendium to review, to read through, and to receive inspiration for how a shift in DRR towards more prevention and risk mitigation can be achieved, and how multiple benefits can be integrated when implementing disaster risk reduction measures. I would also now like to open the floor for questions, if there are any, either through the text box or through unmuting your mic.
This is Ray here, Yana. This is Ray from India. I am in Delhi.
Yes, welcome, Ray.
Yeah, good to have your presentation. It's very, very useful and informative. What I liked is the practicality of the whole thing and your blend of nature-based solutions with disaster risk reduction. That very interesting harmonization of that. Also, the question of risk staircase is a very simple graphic that is useful for a practitioner. Now, with the recent climate agenda where land degradation and neutrality is also a big issue, what is the tenure that you have worked with in these communities? 3 years, 5 years to get to that level of sustaining it and protecting environment? What is your time frame?
Question to you, referring to the different technologies that we documented?
Yeah, I mean, the sense, the overall intervention and your evidence building.
Yes, so the interventions that are documented have usually, let's say, regular development project time frame between 3 years for one phase, but often, as for the case for Tajikistan, the evidence was built over more than a decade. So it can vary. It can vary for the depending on the technologies or the approach that we documented. But generally, I would say the duration of each intervention that we documented was 3 to 6 years, and project related.
Good.
So it documents projects from 8 different members of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform and their partners.
Good. Thank you. That's a good one. Yeah.
Thank you, Ray. Okay, I see one question. To what degree do you see knowledge around NBS? Well, from this difficult question and good question, what comes to my mind is a different product or a different product that was not done by the Swiss NGO DRR Platform, but rather comes from the water community, which is a Blue Schools approach, which ideally aims at linking water sanitation integration into the educational curricula, linking it with the setup of school gardens, and as a third step, integration of land management into school curricula to have a better understanding of how how water, land management, and climate implications are linked. In this publication, I have to say that we focused mostly on landscape-based approaches, rather classical sustainable land management approaches, with a DRR component, or vice versa, where we analyzed classic DRR work with the additional lens of how they contribute to sustainable land management.
Maybe I can
yes,
just complement to this question also. I mean, this publication, this VOCA publication, which Jana presented, didn't have the aim as such to use it for education. But I think documentation, this is always the first step to make use of it further, being it for training purpose, for education, and so on. It was not the main goal. But you can also see on the website, we will later indicate you the link on events, or under the events angle of the Swiss NGO DRR Platform website. You can see, for instance, we made last year's, or in the past, there was also a specific learning event that we did on how to integrate DRR in education as a specific topic linked then to education. So you can download there also the presentations and the report. And then we also elaborated through the platform an e-learning course, which is really has this kind of rather educative or learning aspects on it. It was not specifically linked to this publication now, but we did this, we covered this through other activities.
Okay. If there are no urgent questions at the moment, I would like to continue, since I'm still presenting another project, which in comparison with the product that I just presented is very brief and very concise. It is a PDF document, a packing list, we called it, a packing list for your advocacy journey towards climate and disaster resilient development. In 2018, the platform organized their annual workshop around the topic of advocacy for climate and disaster resilience. And this packing list, this document is basically the essence. It distills the main features or items that you, as practitioner, should take with you when you are embarking on a journey, on an advocacy journey. That means engaging in advocacy work for climate and disaster resilience. Why did we produce this? First, it was a wish by the participants of this workshop, 40 participants from 4 continents that met late in 2018 in Switzerland, to have a very practical, brief guidance on what to think about and how to structure advocacy work, mostly from the perspective of non-governmental organizations in the field of DRR and adaptation. We started with the question, why do we do advocacy in these fields, and or generally in these fields, which is one, to bring about change, to scale change, to make change sustainable, and to transform power structures, and to have a very good standing on how to go about advocacy for disaster and climate resilience. We partnered with the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction, GNDR, who are very active on advocacy, also through a methodology called Frontline, or Views from the Frontline, where they documented numerous advocacy initiatives on from community-based organizations. So, with the objective to ease the take on advocacy, mostly for non-governmental organizations and community-based organizations, through a simple guide, to convince more stakeholders to work on climate advocacy, and thus on the longer term to contribute to climate and disaster resilience, climbing higher on decision makers and political agendas, we published this this packing list. How does it look like? I will just give you a brief glimpse into the PDF, which is also available on the website. You find there also a more practical overview or more illustrated overview of the case studies that we discussed during the workshop, where these 5 pillars are also highlighted. So we defined 5 items, 5 pillars that are really important, and you should keep in mind when planning an advocacy initiative on climate and disaster resilience. You should always ask yourself, why is it important in the context of climate change and or disasters? We address key questions that you should ask yourself, and we give step-by-step recommendations for each of the 5 items or each of the 5 pillars. And these 5 pillars that we defined are the clarity to define strategic and context-specific goals, the collaboration involve allies and opponents, which particularly for non-governmental organizations where there are many smaller organizations that may work towards similar goals. So be very, very clear on who contributes to the same strategic and context-specific goals that you have formulated. Then very important, the evidence, build up credibility. That was an issue that we discussed widely during the workshop, and where we feel we have to be very careful as NGOs to be clear on what we are able to prove and which other evidence, be it scientific evidence, be it anecdotal evidence, we can use and we can mix to build up credibility, to allow local voices being heard, but also allow scientific evidence on climate change being incorporated into the advocacy initiative. Climate change and disaster risk reduction being very broad topics, we also identified focus on or focus as a very important topic. Very important pillar to define very specific action and very specific communication. You cannot cover it all. And last but not least, flexibility, a constant review, a constant reflection and constant learning process to incorporate new findings, to incorporate new initiatives into your advocacy work. But again, with a link to the 4th pillar, to focus, you can never reflect everything, you can never incorporate everything. So with in the frame of your very specific focus, be flexible and be a learning organization, so to speak. Yes, the publication, it's a 4-pager. You can download it. You can also print it. We have it here hanging in our offices, guiding us when we are planning advocacy work. As a reminder that we cannot do everything, but what we are planning on doing in advocacy on climate change and disaster risk reduction, we should be doing focused, strategic, and with a clear take on evidence. So, if there are questions, please unmute your mic as done before, or type in your question here in the chat box. Okay, this does not seem to be the case. If other questions are coming up, you can always ask them in the chat box. Maybe you can mention me, so I know that the question refers to one of the products I was presenting, and we can take them up in the end of the webinar. I would now like to hand over to Manuel from CBM Switzerland, who is going to present the inclusive disaster risk reduction hands-on tool.
Thank you very much, Jana, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Manuel from CBM Switzerland, and I'm happy to present the inclusive disaster risk reduction hands-on tool now. So let's start with a bit of background and why we developed this tool, and also what we mean when we say inclusion or inclusive. So we know that there's growing awareness in the DR community that people who face exclusion in society, and this might be because of their gender, their age, disability, or maybe their ethnic or cultural background, are facing a disproportionately higher disaster risk. They're more often left behind when disaster happens, and they're less often included in disaster risk reduction program. So within a broader sense, there is a leave no one behind movement, which is aware and tries to counter the exclusion that still happens, not only in disaster risk reduction, but also in other areas of development or humanitarian aid. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, for example, states in the guiding principles that disaster risk reduction requires an all-of-society engagement and partnership. It requires empowerment and inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory participation, paying special attention to people disproportionately affected by disaster, especially the poorest. And a gender, age, and disability and cultural perspective should be integrated in all policies and practices. So this is basically our guiding framework for why we developed this tool. We know that there's many documents out there, many policies or guidelines are available on inclusive disaster risk reduction, but in many of them, inclusion is explained in quite a broad sense on a programming level. And few available tools go really into the details on how to achieve inclusion in the day-to-day work of people working on the ground, in the field practitioners in DRR at the community level. Many of the available tools also focus on the inclusion of one specific at-risk group. So, for example, exclusively on persons with disabilities. There's some tools which look at older persons, and some tools take a gender perspective. And this is the gap that we're trying to fill with this hands-on tool, which provides, on the one hand, very short and very practical instructions for inclusion. And on the other hand, it tries to take all these different perspectives to inclusion and make sure that all at-risk groups in the communities are included in DRR programs. The easy-to-use tool is made for field practitioners, and it provides specifically the information that is relevant for them in their day-to-day work. And I will give you some examples. So the tool itself is a so-called progressive web application, which means it is both a website and a mobile phone app. So it can be used online on a desktop, just as any other website, or it can be downloaded to a mobile device and then used offline, for example, when field practitioners are in areas where they have bad or no internet connection. The tool includes around 100 short practical guidelines or checklists. So we call them task cards because they're specifically made for a particular task that somebody is doing within a larger DRR program. The task cards, or the tool itself, is split into 5 sections. One is on general concepts of inclusion and accessibility. The second is on prevention and mitigation. The third is on risk assessment. The fourth is on preparedness, household level preparedness, community preparedness, preparedness for response. And then the fifth is on risk transfer. And in each of these sections, there are about 10 to 30 of these task cards covering the relevant topics that would be relevant for a field practitioner in their work. So some examples. In the risk assessment section, for example, there is a card on how to conduct an inclusive community mapping process. There is one task card or checklist on how to conduct an inclusive transact walk. There is one card on specific community assets, which should be considered from the perspective of different at-risk groups in risk assessment. In the section for preparedness, for example, there's a card on how to train first responders in inclusive search and rescue. There are several cards on how to build accessible evacuation shelter, really going into the detail of how to ensure that access to the shelter is accessible for everyone, latrines, doors, how to make sure that there's sufficient chairs available. So it really goes into the details of how to ensure that a shelter is inclusive for everyone. And for example, another example, there's a card on early warning, how to disseminate early warning information in different accessible formats. And each of these task cards outlines key action points which should be followed to ensure inclusion of all the different at-risk groups. As I said, including how to make sure that people with disabilities have access and can participate, older persons, there's a gender perspective, but there's also cultural perspective, considering ethnic minorities, religious, cultural minorities, language minorities, where a specific effort needs to be done within DRR programming to make sure that they're included and can participate and benefit equally from DRR measures. Also, there's link to further documents, so further guidelines that are available online or provided in each of the cards. So there's always a very brief and short instruction on what could you do concretely in your day-to-day work, but then there's also links for further reading if you want to dig deeper into a specific issue. The tool itself was designed to be easy to navigate and really intuitively be understood by users. Without having background in inclusion or inclusive DRR as such. It's really for DRR practitioners which might have not thought about inclusion much so far. To find the right piece of information for a particular task, the user can either navigate, browse the tool, go through the different sections and subsections and should be able to find the right card, or they can use a search function which leads them directly to the task at hand. Then the cards themselves are also linked to each other horizontally and vertically according to keywords. So it's always possible to, if you want to know more about a certain aspect, to click on the relevant keyword and then be directed to a different card, which gives you more background. There's also the option to customize the tool a little bit by saving and sharing favorite and kind of putting together your key checklists for your daily work. The tool was released recently, so we have the beta version available since this month. It's available on the website of the DRR platform and can be downloaded immediately. There might still be a few technical glitches which we have to iron out, and the content would also be expanded over the coming months. But basically, most of the content is there and the tool can be readily used. Over the next year or so, so 2020 is really where we will try to field test the tool. So we have a tool, we have a team of people from different platform members which will support this piece of work on field testing this tool, identifying and filling gaps in the content, and also test and improve the functionality and usability for the field practitioners. Also, we will translate the tool in different languages, and for next year we have we're planning to translate the tool into French, Spanish, Indonesian, and Bangla as the first 4 languages for translation. We have seen from examples from other tools that obviously it is imperative that the tool is available in the language of field practitioners, also of DRR practitioners working for governments in the affected communities, that it is usable for them. So let me end with saying that this process of field testing and of enriching the content of these tools should be dynamic, and it should involve a wide variety of practitioners. And in that sense, it's very open for everyone in the Swiss DRR platform, but also outside. DRR or humanitarian practitioners who would like to contribute to expanding the content of this tool can contact me anytime, and we're very happy to welcome you in the team and make sure you can contribute to further improving this tool over the coming year. That's it, so I will open up for questions. If there are any, please go ahead.
Yes, Manuel, this is Ray here.
Hello.
Hi. Good presentation, and good to know that very hands-on and easy to navigate kind of toolbox you have created. This is great. I'm focusing for last decade on child-centered approaches. Have you, by design, included anything specific? Because Sendai framework, in one of its very profound statements, says we see children and youth as agents of change and so on. So do you have anything specific in those 100 cards that you spoke of? And my second question is about the early warning, because personally I'm doing some work on child-centered early warning systems using some local practices that we have been implementing for last 5 to 7 years. So that's an area that I was thinking if it be possible that we can tie up. So these are my 2 points. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ray, and that's a very good point. So the current content that we have in the tool was developed by a team of 6 DR and inclusion experts. But it tries to incorporate a child perspective as much as possible. But I have to say that this is probably the area where the tool is weakest at the moment. And this was very much also on my mind, that expanding and reviewing the tool over the next months will require that we have experts like yourself on a child-centered approach is also part of the team. So in that sense, I would be very happy if we could team up in that regard. And then on early warning, yes, there are some cards on early warning. And again, it tries to incorporate all different inclusion perspectives. But again, any feedback and review of the cards will be very welcome.
This is
Great.
Bo from Cameroon.
Hello, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to find out, maybe I missed something. Did you mention the different areas we can apply this to? I didn't get this, so that I can also think of how we can put this into practice in our work here in the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. That's also a very good question. So, which it's something I did forget to mention, that we're trying to develop the content so it works in different risk contexts. So it's a little bit heavy at the moment on flood risk areas because there were several colleagues from Asian countries involved. But definitely it would be very much the idea that it's expanded to also involve the risk context which might be relevant in other countries. And I'm thinking specifically of drought areas, and I'm also thinking of conflict sensitive or fragile contexts. So in that sense, again, we would very much want to expand the content in that area. Are there any other questions? Burning questions? Otherwise, I will hand over to my colleague Tony, who will present the next tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I'm just waiting. Okay, now I have the screen. Warm welcome from my side to all the participants, or good afternoon for those who are more in the east. The indicator toolbox actually is, let me see if it works, sorry, yeah, it's actually composed of 2 elements. An Excel-based tool, which is available as an offline and an online version. And the offline version is easy to use in any context, also in the field. And then, secondly, a guidance note that explains on 7 pages the structure of the tool and how to use it. As you can see on the guidance note, as well as on the next slide, again, the risk staircase that has been mentioned by Jana already. It also serves as core element of the toolbox. It reflects the Swiss understanding of an integrated risk management and provides a clear sequencing of risk reduction measures, as has been already explained by Jana. When we look at the structure, then we see that the toolbox is based on the log frame logic. The underlying theory of change stresses a systematic approach with interlinkages between the output, the outcome, and impact level. Consequently, the toolbox, the impacts of the toolbox relate to resilience. Outcomes are covering measures along the risk staircase, and the focus of the toolbox is on the outcome level, where changes in terms of physical protection as well as behavior and knowledge are expected to happen. The impacts in the toolbox are formulated in a generic way. They relate to the overall goals of strengthened resilience and reduced poverty. But as the impact level is often out of reach of the interventions of standalone local level DRR NGO projects, no indicators were formulated at this level. Let's say the respective indicators are contained in the Sendai framework and SDG frameworks. And the toolbox does not contain outputs, as they depend to a great extent on the type of project and context. Therefore, the users of the toolbox are encouraged to formulate their specific outputs and related indicators. When we look now at the outcomes, we have for all sections of the risk staircase, as well as for the field risk knowledge, that's on the very bottom of the slide, a set of outcomes and related indicators, which are suitable for the work of NGOs. For the bearing of risks, which is the last outcome, to the right, a generic outcome is formulated. However, we decided to refrain from adding indicators because we are missing here common experience. So you see the toolbox contains 12 outcomes in total, and they are also formulated in a generic way. They have to be contextualized within a concrete program or project. And for each outcome, we propose two generic formulations, a more neutral one that's in the top line, and a more actor-specific formulation. But again, they are generic and they need to be contextualized. When going now through the toolbox, we will always take the example of outcome 3, human beings, settlements, critical infrastructure are safe. Now you see here a list of 69 indicators. Of course, you cannot read it. It's just, and it makes me a bit dizzy looking at it. So don't look at it too closely. It's just an indication of all the 69. They are based on basis of an Excel file that can be downloaded as offline version. The indicators are color-coded as per the steps of the risk staircase, and they are arranged according to the outcomes and further arranged according to characteristics of the respective outcome. And here, just as an example, we again look at the outcome, human being, settlements, critical infrastructure are safe. And here we would have in total 8 indicators, and they are arranged at, let's say, sub-criteria or sub-characteristics. You see here level of risk reduction, state of application of hazard resilient design, or state of accessibility. We just noted when we were developing the toolbox that we needed those criteria to further define the outcomes. Then what we have, you cannot read it, but we will have a look when we browse through it just later. We have as a, let's say, as a explanation of the indicator, we would have a description, then a numerator, references to numerator, to denominator, to a target value, and means of verification. The indicators are formulated in a short and simple way. They are also generic and have to be adapted, expanded, or specified according to the project focus and country context in order to become smart. Each indicator is also coded with a specific number. Now, when we maneuver online, I hope that this will become a bit clearer. And we follow again the example of outcome 3, human beings, etc. are safe. When you, I cannot show it here, but when you hover over the outcomes, prevent impact and mitigate impact, this step will open up and show the outcomes as you see there. And I click then on the first outcome, again, human beings, etc. are safe. And if we click on that, then we will have a list, the list of all the indicators for this outcome. A list of indicators with the indicator and the description only. And you see here they are 8 in total, from 301 to 308. And when you click on a specific indicator, for instance, the one that is marked red, 304, let's do that, then you will find more details. All the details will then provided besides outcome code, indicator, and description that you have in the list before. These are the outcome characteristic, the numerator, denominator, target value, disaggregation, and method and source of verification. And you have noted that in this same list, under the indicator, under the outcome, human beings, etc. are safe, that there are 2 indicators that are marked red, 301 and 307. Those are standard indicator, and for each outcome, we propose at least 1 standard indicator. In total, we have 12, and the ones here, we propose 2, one for the characteristic level of risk reduction and 307 for the characteristic state of accessibility. And for those standard indicators, we provide additional guidance. And this in terms of which data and how it should be collected. The guidance includes questionnaires and calculation instructions to measure the indicator for those 12 standard indicators. Where do we stand? It's not 100% finalized. We have, as Manuel said, probably also a beta version. We are just about finalizing the indicators that we have developed so far, and the data collection and analysis package as well. Also, we have, I would say, not yet a definitive location of a definite website location where the tool is, but the entire tool will be final and easily accessible on the platform website by the end of February 2020. So that was browsing through this tool in a nutshell. Do you have any questions? That doesn't seem to be the case. You can always also write your questions on the bottom left page. But then I would hand over to my colleague Georg for the evaluation for the CBA cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Welcome from my side to everybody as well. My name is Georg Heim, and like Tony, DRR advisor at the Swiss Red Cross. So I would like to present you some tools for the evaluation of cost-benefit analysis. And for that reason, I would like to start with a short video, about 10 seconds. I hope it What you can see here is a debris flow event in 2015 in Chosica in Peru, where many people died. Many houses have been destroyed because of a debris flow, which occurs in that area every 5, 6, 10 years. So it's very frequent and very intensive, this kind of events. So this is the photo from the day after in Chosica, in this small catchment. And for sure, if you ask person living there, may it be necessary to build a mitigation measure? So the response will be clearly from their point of view. For sure, it has to be built mitigation measures, and it justifies the investment. What about if you ask the authorities of this region of Chosica? So their answer probably will be different, because they don't have to protect just one small catchment, as we see the red one, that's where occurred the debris flow event. There are many small catchments, and all of them have a huge population in the alluvial cone. So many people could be or are at risk. So as funds are limited, authorities will not can build mitigation measures in each of these small catchments. So for authorities, they have to prioritize. And for that reason, it's important to do a cost-benefit analysis to check which one of these catchments has the highest risks and which one of these possible mitigation measures could reduce the risks. So this picture, which is, I think, very, very, very known in a cost-benefit analysis, we compare the costs of mitigation measures with its benefit. But the question is always, how can we measure benefit of activities or mitigation measures to reduce risks? So how can we measure effects of measures? I would like to start with some small definitions. So the benefit is the difference between a potential damage that can occur in a certain time between the actual situation without measure and compared with measures. And as definition, a potential damage per year, per certain period of time. Normally we measure it per year. The potential damage per year is defined as the risk. So in that case, the same question, the benefit is the reduction of the risk without measures compared with the risk with the measure, and we estimate it with normally with money per year. There is a very known equation, simple equation used in the NGO world. That means the risk is defined as the hazard multiplied with the vulnerability, physical vulnerability of houses, or could also be farmland, divided by the capacity of the people to avoid damage. In the next slide, I will focus more on this of this equation. So finally, the cost benefit is the risk reduction compared with the costs. Coming back to this basic equation, risk is hazard multiplied by vulnerability divided by capacity. So that means to define the level of risk, we need to know the hazards. And for that, we need to have information about extension, frequency, and intensity of dangerous processes like inundation or landslides. Rockfall could be also drought. That's what you see on the on the upper left side of this slide. So you have different colors that show the inundation zone for a river in the middle, this blue line, and on the left and on the right side you see 3 different hazard levels, and you see in purple some houses which are within the hazardous area. On the other side, we have to know the physical vulnerability of exposed objects, like, for example, houses, streets, infrastructure, or agricultural assets. And as I mentioned before, the capacity is the capacity to avoid damages. So we have to, or the idea of this approach that I would like to present to you further on is how can we determine this level of risks, and how can we define the risk reduction due to mitigation measures. And for sure, the mitigation measure always intends to influence the risk params to reach our the benefit we would like to have. So there are 4 cost-benefit analysis tools that we have within the DRR platform analyzed and checked its application. On the one hand, there's the Caritas tool, elaborated by Caritas. It's a very simplified approach. It consists on a very comprehensible handbook. It's about a 10 or 12 pager. Where step by step it informs you how to calculate the risks. It's a quantitative tool. It's a handbook. It's not really a tool, it's a handbook. It's for sure, it's free available in Spanish and in English. You can define direct risks. That means a flood occurs and person dies. So that's the direct damage that can occur. It does not consider indirect losses. That means losses that can occur within a long time, within weeks or months. That's not covered by the Caritas tool. As it is not based on a map, on a topographic map, it's a little bit difficult, the transparency, and for that reason also a little bit difficult to use it as an advocacy. So you can use it for advocacy, but it's not fully transparent. And as I know, there's no calculation tool like an Excel tool available. You have the instruction by the handbook, but it's not really a tool. There's another cost-benefit analysis tool from the Swiss Red Cross, elaborated in 2017 and updated this year. It's an Excel tool. It comes also with a handbook in Spanish and in English, where you can enter risk params, like the scenarios you would like to consider. Oh, first, what kind of hazardous process you would like to consider. For example, inundation. Sorry, it's in Spanish. Sorry for that. Inundation or landslide or debris flow. Then you define your scenarios. That means the return period of the hazardous process, like every 5 year or every 10 year, every 100 year that a dangerous process can occur. I don't go to details. You can also consider the costs of your mitigation measures and so on, or then you have to define the hazard level in lines for each object which is exposed to this hazard. For example, in that line a hospital, in the next line a house, etc., etc. And the tool calculates automatically the monetized risks for your objects. And you will do the same calculation on the right side of this picture for the situation considering the mitigation measures, and then it calculates you automatically the beneficial cost ratio and helps you to justify your investment. It's free of charge. It considers direct and indirect risks, but as the tool before, the Caritas tool, it's not based on maps, so it's a little bit difficult to convince authorities which are not familiarized daily with the thematic. The third tool I would like to present is the so-called Resilience Toolbox, or in Latin America it's called Mi Resiliencia, which is has been elaborated by STC, by the Swiss government. It's a map-based, a web GIS-based tool where you can digitalize your hazard map, shown in green here. You can also digitalize in the tool itself all the exposed objects like houses, infrastructure, and so on. So in 7 steps, you receive the information about the cost-benefit ratio. It is very easy, the handling, so everybody can do that. It's not necessary to have knowledge in GIS. It is available in Spanish and in English as well. You can work with predefined params, or you can define your params values by your own. There is an ex and import possibility for GIS for those working with GIS, and it's a good tool for advocacy because it's transparent, easily understandable. There are some disadvantages for this tool. It's not free. You have to buy licenses. You don't have to do the hosting by yourself, but it needs costs for the hosting of the tool. And so you have a certain dependency to the provider. And at least there's a fourth tool. It's the IFRC tool from the Federation. This is a qualitative tool with a highly participative approach to determine the cost-beneficial ratio of mitigation measures. The benefit in that sense here is defined as the increase of well-being of individuals or communities. Increase of well-being can be regarding of money, but can also be social benefits. So it has a broad application, this tool. And the costs are considered as investments could be money or also working time. It starts with a vulnerability and capacity assessment, the VCA, and then in a participative way, people compare different mitigation measure options, and within discussions they prioritize the best mitigation option. So as I mentioned before, it's fully qualitative. It comes with a handbook in Spanish and English. It has a highly acceptance within the community because they are totally themselves defining the possible mitigation measures. It has also some disadvantages, which are low transparency because of this participatory manner, and it's not really precision due to its simplifications, and as it is not quantifiable, the decisions. So each of these 4 tools has its applications respecting the situation where you are. And within the DRR platform, we provided a short overview of these 4 tools and a short guideline to look for the tool that fits best for you. For example, it starts with questions: do you prefer a quantitative tool to a qualitative tool? If no, if you are well with a qualitative tool, just go to the right and use the IFRC tool, where you don't need to have a hazard map necessarily. But if you want to have a quantitative tool, it asks you if you need to have a sound assessment for the basis of decision making. If you don't have, you can probably work with the Caritas tool, where you need to have hazard maps. Without it won't work. If you need to have a sound assessment, a detailed analysis, so you can work with the SRC tool. And if you have resources, financial resources, and also time to determine all these risk params, you can choose this SDC tool, Mi Resiliencia, or so-called resilience toolbox. For the last 2 tools, you need to have hazard maps, including for the Mi Resiliencia or the resilience toolbox. You need also to have intensity maps, which is a little bit different of hazard maps. So this is the short overview of these 4 tools. I'm just looking for questions. I think regarding the presented tools, I can't see any questions in the chat box, but maybe there are questions from your side. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, very informative. I just wanted to check with you. We're quite new to CBA, and we've really not been able to conduct one before. We wanted to check with you, when should we think of conducting the CBA? Should this be during a project or before a project or program?
Okay, thanks for the question, Wu. I think in each moment within your project that you are planning a mitigation measures, it shouldn't be a decision made by the stomach. That means I think that could be it's worth the money, but the idea is to check in fact the cost benefit ratio, to not create conflicts when you spend money in a specific area to realize a protection or a mitigation measures, and then you won't have money to invest in another catchment. So there are several cases where conflict built because of decision making by authorities, because once they said, why did you spend for them and not for me? And when you don't have a clear response that you can bring in evidence your decision, there is a certain risk to create some conflict. So I think, to come back to your question, it's within a running project where, when you have already done your hazard assessment and you are thinking about mitigation measure before establish it, it's a good idea to realize this cost-benefit analysis.
Hi, another question. This is Chris from Tier Fund. Any of these tools would you say are more useful in fragile and conflict-affected states?
From my point of view, I think they work as well in fragile contexts, but I don't have that much experience, Chris, in working in fragile contexts. So probably there are other persons with more experience working in that areas. From my point of view, it's very important, even in fragile contexts, to justify your decision making for the aspects I mentioned before. But we can open up to give answer to that question.
Maybe just to complement your question, I think that's very important one. I think a cost-benefit analysis, it depends always a bit what you aim at. Is it rather about to have facts and figures and to have something in a report? Then you might rather go maybe for a more sophisticated, more technical tool. Or is it maybe rather about the process, bringing people together and sharing experiences and evidence? Then it might be rather also a participatory tool that is worthwhile. So I think this depends on the context. I think particularly in fragile context, probably this transparent and participatory element is highly relevant there. And I think that also refers to the first question, when do you want to do a cost-benefit analysis? It again depends, what do you aim at? Do you want to justify the investment of a project that you're going to plan? Or do you want, after the end of the project, justify again or have the proof that it was worthwhile, the investment? Or is it during the planning phase? Do you want to compare different scenarios, different options? So it really depends a bit on the goal. That's always important to have this clearly in mind.
Thanks, Evelyn, for these additional remarks. Are there other questions? Okay, so I think I will hand on to Evelyn for the next slides.
Okay, with that, I would just like a very short reference to e-learning course. It's not part of the product that we are going to present now. I would just like to have it mentioned here because it was a product that we elaborated earlier in 2017. We elaborated an e-learning course which consists in 4 modules. You can download it on the link, which I just put it on the text box on the left side. It's meant for self-paced learning, so it's really a kind of an introduction crash course. What is DRR about? What are different measures? What are the different basic concepts? So I think it's always a useful reference for those who are really starting to get familiar with DRR climate change adaptation concepts. Okay, so with that, we are at the end of the presentation of these new products. I think some of the presentation might might have been a little bit abstract without having seen these different tools yet. So I just invite you to download it on the link which I just shared earlier. Or just retyping it in the text box there. You can see, download them and have calmly look at it. And as mentioned, there are some of them are a little bit more specific and need a little bit of background information, as the last tool, for instance, that we have seen now in the cost-benefit analysis, whereas others are really for more general public and are also much easier and accessible also for any kind of context. Yes, with that, I would just like to make a last reference to upcoming events of the Swiss NGO DRR platform for the upcoming year. So also for the next year, there are a series of events that we plan to organize. There is webinars, there is kind of one-day learning events in Switzerland, as well as an annual key event, a workshop of several days. So, as mentioned, according to the format, they can be attended in person in Switzerland or also by Skype from anywhere in the field. The most relevant upcoming two events are now in January. There is one webinar on effective advocacy for DRR, which will be hosted by Save the Children together with GNDR. And then we have later in mid-January, we'll have a learning event on GMO in agriculture with a focus on risk reduction. That's a one-day learning event that will be held in Switzerland. Then later in the end, we will have a 2 to 3 day workshop in autumn on the topic of the nexus between humanitarian aid and development, again with a focus on disaster risk reduction as kind of a linking element. So for all these events, you can check them online for further information, which we will put on the website link, which you can just see there. We have also planned a couple of other events, especially webinars related to other topics such as DRR and climate change adaptation basics, working at scale through alliances, through work together with other platforms and networks, one on urban DRR, and also again another webinar at the beginning of the year. There will be another webinar also on the Nexus Humanitarian and Development in order to prepare the yearly face-to-face event. Okay, that's all with regards to the outlook. And last but not least, I would like to invite you to participate in a very short survey we made with regard to this webinar, because it's a format I think that's interesting to make it accessible also for people in the field in different countries, and we're always interested in getting your feedback in order to improve it for further events. So it would be great if you could fill out the survey, where you can just see the link in the text box again. And with that, I would like to close this webinar. Many thanks for your participation, and I hope to meet you again personally or virtually in one of our upcoming platform events. Thank you. Bye.